Live from Washington, I'm Aisha Tanzim and you're watching Access Point. Another day of violence in Egypt and dozens more dead in clashes with the police, even as people were still dealing with the over 600 dead bodies and thousands injured in Wednesday's military crackdown. Muslim Brotherhood supporters marked it a day of rage. Let's go straight to Cairo, where our correspondent Elizabeth Arad joins us via Skype. Elizabeth, what's the situation on the ground right now?
Well, it's a very dangerous point in the day. Curfew has gone into effect. The military and security forces say they will deal very severely with anyone who violates the laws, which would be the curfew. And we still have tens of thousands of protesters on the street. We've seen fighting build throughout the day. And now as darkness has fallen, people are really worried it's just going to get that much worse.
Elizabeth, we heard reports of violence today, but it wasn't clear where the violence was coming from. Can you describe what was happening throughout the day?
Well, it started quite peacefully. Right after midday prayers, people poured out in the streets, tens of thousands of people here in the capital and across the country. But very quickly, it started to deteriorate. We saw that even among the people, the supposedly peaceful protesters, there were men carrying weapons. They also ran into not just security forces they had conflict with, but also civilians that were armed. And it's not clear if they were aligned with security forces or just people who are angry at the situation. The tensions are so high here, and it's quite confused and fluid. So it's not completely clear who those armed civilians were.
Elizabeth, we know that the Muslim Brotherhood supporters are out today. The Muslim Brotherhood called to mark it a day of rage, but a lot of Egyptians who supported the military coup, did you hear anything from them today? Did you see them anywhere on the streets?
Well, Tamara, the group that was behind, or it was the face of the June 30th protest that led to President Morsi's ouster and the military takeover, they had called for counter demonstrations. I think those were very, very small numbers. People, were careening around town trying to get home before the marches began. And I think a lot of just average citizens tried to stay inside. So there really wasn't a big, counter demonstration. There's just a great fear of violence. And I think a lot of people just want to get out of the way.
And we also heard unconfirmed reports of a helicopter firing down Ramses Square as protesters were gathered here. What are you hearing about that, or is there any confirmation?
We don't have any confirmation. The Muslim Brotherhood released a statement saying that a helicopter had fired into the crowd with machine guns. Again, no confirmation. Certainly there have been witnesses saying that someone else said it was from a helicopter. But there was so much gunfire going on. Other people said, yes, there's the helicopters. They were there. But whether the gunfire came from there or came from the ground or rooftops, which we've been seeing for the last few days, snipers at various places up higher, it's just not clear.
But has the Muslim Brotherhood given any indication of what they intend to do tomorrow as the sun rises?
I think just getting through the night is a very, very difficult situation. They've certainly said they are going to continue their protests until Mr. Morsi is reinstated. That seems a very, very difficult proposition at this point. So no one really knows where this is going to end. Reconciliation seems off the table for right now. So it's just difficult almost hour by hour at this point.
And the military has indicated it's not going to let up and it's going to deal decisively with anyone who breaks the curfew. Is there any indication of whether they intend a crackdown through the night?
They did. There are strong indications, both by those statements that you just mentioned. The Army also deployed additional tanks and armored personnel carriers throughout the city. And they are under a state of emergency, so they can use these laws of detention quite easily to just round people up and not have to do the regular course of due process. So they have many tools at their disposal to try and disperse these sit-ins. And they vowed, the Interior Minister said, that we won't allow any sit-ins anywhere. So they're really trying to clear the streets.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for bringing us live information from Cairo. Meanwhile, international condemnation is growing. EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton blamed the interim government for the crisis, and Turkey called it a massacre. President Barack Obama interrupted his vacation yesterday to rebuke the Egyptian military.
We are canceling our biannual joint military exercise, which was scheduled for next month. Going forward, I've asked my national security team to assess the implications of the actions taken by the interim government and further steps that we may take as necessary with respect to the U.S.-Egyptian relationship.
Canceling the military exercises, but not canceling the $1.3 billion in aid to the military yet. We'll discuss what all of this means with our guests. Ken Soffer with the Center for American Progress focuses on U.S. policy in the Middle East, and Dr. Graham Bannerman is a Middle East analyst who's worked both with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the State Department. Welcome to Access Point. Mr. Soffer, starting with you, this situation, was there any indication that the military intended for this level of a crackdown?
I'm not sure if people necessarily knew that we were going to get this level of a crackdown. I think that everyone was pretty aware that with the Morsi protesters gathered, with the military kind of surrounding them, that there was no way you were going to clear the protest area without it getting violent. And I think that American officials have been pressing for quite a long time, for the past few days, do not try to clear, do not try to open them up, do not use force against them. And we saw a delay over a few days as we were hoping maybe something else would come out of this where we didn't have this sort of violent breakup. But, once that failed, once they moved in, we kind of knew that we were going to get some level of violence. But this is really beyond, I think, what a lot of us had really expected.
Dr. Bannerman, why the violence? Why trying to break up the protests?
Well, I think this feeling among the most Egyptians was that the continuation of the protest was no longer tenable, because you had 6 weeks with no progress in the political arena, and you had a complete disruption of the Egyptian economy as these protests broke down in the center of Cairo. And if you talk to a majority of Egyptians, the pressure was on the military and on the police. And remember, this was a police action primarily, and to take action against the strike, the occupation, because you could make no progress in Egypt on either the political or economic front as long as they continued.
Yeah, but the international leaders have indicated that there was a chance. We know Catherine Ashton was there talking to Mr. Morsi, but also both sides. Even President Obama, in his comments yesterday, suggested that he thought there might have been another way. Let's listen to what President Obama said yesterday.
After the military's intervention several weeks ago, there remained a chance for reconciliation and an opportunity to pursue a democratic path. Instead, we've seen a more dangerous path taken through arbitrary arrests, a broad crackdown on Mr. Morsi's associations and supporters, and now, tragically, the violence that's taken the lives of hundreds of people and wounded thousands more.
As we heard, President Obama said there was, Mr. Soffer, a chance for reconciliation. Was there?
I mean, I think that there's, always been an opportunity. I think the hope has been among most, American and Western diplomats that we could start taking the first initial steps towards a more inclusive, more representative government. But I think it kind of speaks against what the main calculus of the Egyptian military right now. I mean, I think that while there may be some within the Egyptian military who were kind of hoping for some sort of talks or reform to go into place, I think a lot of folks in the Egyptian military view this as an incredible opportunity to, put an end to a kind of their key ideological rival for the past 6 decades. I mean, this goes back to the Free Officers Movement. This goes back to kind of Sadat's assassination, Mubarak's crackdown. This has been a very long kind of ongoing battle between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptian military. I think a lot of the folks in the military view this as an opportunity with a majority of Egyptians behind them to really step in and finally kind of end their main existential threat.
Even though the Brotherhood did get elected and it was trying to come into mainstream politics, Dr. Bannerman?
I would have to disagree some with that assessment of the military's position. I think the military has made a lot of decisions over the last years and made a lot of evolution, as has Egyptian society. People have changed their views from they were in the past. I think people look forward to the election of a president that they move to the democratic process. I think there was an alienation within Egyptian society as a whole that the Muslim Brotherhood was not acting as Egyptians first, but acting as part of the international Islamic movement first and Egyptians second, and that alienated a large segment of society. And then you had all of the demonstrations. I think people were taken back by the massive side of the June 30th popular demonstrations. They were much bigger than anybody anticipated. They were bigger than January 25th. And at that point, the military faced a difficult situation. You had 2 rival camps, both of significant size. Where would we have been today if those demonstrations had continued in hostility towards each other? It would have been violence. I think they thought that they could put forward a plan that would bring Egyptian society back together. President Morsi had to be stepped down, he had to be replaced, but they also think, and this is where I disagree with you, is I think they believe and they know today that the Muslim Brotherhood is a fundamental part of the fabric of Egyptian society. They said from the beginning, from the first statement, that everybody has to participate. And every conversation I've had with anybody in the interim government or the military has said the same thing.
Now, how do you expect Muslim Brotherhood to participate? They participated in elections. They won the election partly because the liberal left was way too disorganized to mount any kind of electoral movement, and then you oust them. Mr. Sofer, was military justified in saying, let's just come back to the table, have another election?
I mean, I think that you have a lot of disillusionment among Brotherhood members who kind of said, all right, well, you know, we put aside political violence in the 90s. We're going to step in. We're going to play by the rules. We're going to participate in elections, both parliamentary and presidential elections, and had, I mean, for the large part, landslide victories in both. The presidential elections were obviously a lot closer, and I think that they pulled in a lot of folks that were so eager to move beyond the Mubarak regime, so eager to put behind kind of the NDP, that they kind of pulled in a lot of this kind of swing voters. I think at this point, many of the Muslim Brotherhood members may be looking at themselves and saying, I don't know if we would participate in a democratic process. We tried to play by the rules, we won, and we were still removed from power. And I think that that kind of speaks to some of the longer-term challenges of Egypt. Egypt has an important signaling factor with the rest of the region. And if you signal that, you know, Islamists are not welcome and are not welcome to be kind of included in the process in any form, democratic or otherwise, I think that it incentivizes some of the kind of worst and most extreme behavior of some of these groups.
And I'm watching on TV here live pictures. Let's put some of those live pictures up on the screen of the kind of violence that's going on in Egypt. You can also see that on the screen there. Huge, huge fire. I don't know what this building is because I don't read Arabic. But Dr. Beneman, that's the point. I mean, where is this going from here? Is it going according to Egyptian military's calculations, or is it going counter to what they thought would happen?
I don't think this is what in anybody's calculations what would happen. I think what happened in the evolution since the election, the population was faced with a choice. Ahmed Shafiq, who was a representative of the old regime, or the Muslim Brotherhood. Many people were not comfortable with the choice, but they decided it was better to give the Brotherhood a chance because the Brotherhood was the opposition. They did that. The fear was that the Brotherhood would be more loyal to international Islam rather than to Egypt. And Egypt differs from all the other countries in the Middle East in that Egyptian nationalism is very important. Egyptians identify first and foremost as Egyptians, and I think the Brotherhood squandered that through some of its arbitrary decisions last fall, with the president assuming the authorities, with a constitution written by a small group rather than the whole thing, and with the treatment of minorities. He did not attend the Pope's installation. He did not allow the Shias to pray in Hassan Mosque. There was a whole series of things that he alienated other groups in society. People asked him, would you please bring more people in, be more inclusive? And in every choice, he did not do that. Therefore, he lost the legitimacy of the presidency in the eyes of the majority of Egyptians, not just the military. It wasn't the military was second to act. It was clearly the 22 million people who signed the petition and the millions in the square.
Do you agree with his assessment of what's happening there?
I certainly agree with the assessment that the Morsi government was not very inclusive. I think that you kind of had this sort of tyranny of the majority going on. And the sort of majoritarianism that the Muslim Brotherhood put in place, this idea that you know, we won the elections, we have the presidency, and then we can kind of impose our agenda without including others in the political process. And this wasn't others in necessarily the sense of, you know, just they were excluding the military, liberals, secularists. They were excluding oftentimes other Islamist groups. You know, oftentimes some of the Salafi groups were not being included in the political process. And I think that that angered a lot of groups, that they were so exclusionary that their kind of only commitment to democracy was, in essence, the elections, but not the actual kind of democratic governance, which respects minority rights, as Dr. Beneman talked about, you know, that includes the kind of will of the political minority, that at least they have some sort of say in the political process.
And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to focus on what's happening now and what might happen in the future, but wasn't there pressure building on Morsi, and wasn't there a time right before the coup that he was saying, okay, maybe we'll sit down and talk, Dr. Beneman?
No, actually there was not. That was one of the problems. The military, the Minister of Defense the week before said, we'll give you a week to bring some more people into it before the June 30th demonstration. Nothing was done. When the demonstrations occurred, and people were shocked at the size of the demonstration. I mean, we were talking about crowds much larger than in January 2011, that they decided that they had to act. They gave him 2 more days. Please, you have 2 days now, bring other people in, and the Brotherhood refused. That was the problem. They had on one side the overwhelming majority of Egyptian people demanding a change, and on the other, a government that wasn't doing it.
Okay, so now let's talk about the international community's reaction. Mr. Sofer, why is U.S. still not labeling it a coup?
Well, because of the way kind of the laws, U.S. laws are written, by labeling a coup, labeling this a coup that removed a democratically elected government, the administration will be required to suspend all aid, and that includes the $1.5 billion that we spend in military aid every year. And this is an important piece. I think that sometimes people overstate the value of the aid as far as a piece of leverage over the military, over kind of Egyptian politics. But it is important, especially in terms of kind of keeping an open channel of connection. Our military-to-military relations with Egypt are incredibly important. The only real open, viable source of communication we have right now is between Secretary of Defense Hagel and General Sisi. So cutting off that aid, it's not just a signal that you're sending, but it's also cutting off an important line of communication that you have to the top leadership.
And how much of this is the regional strategic calculations, particularly Israel, the Sinai Peninsula, how much of that is into play here, Dr. Bannerman, in not cutting off that aid?
I think it's a more historic relationship. Before 1975 and 1973 to 75, when we began the rapprochement with Egypt after having no relationships, it was a very difficult relationship. Egypt could be very hostile to the United States. A speech by President Nasser could put 10,000 people on the street in any city in the Middle East protesting against us. The decision to improve that relationship has basically transformed the American role and the Egyptian role in the region. We now are a close ally, and we are the dominant force, and we have been since the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. We have developed a very close strategic relationship. Our access to the Suez Canal on an expedited ability allows us to move a carrier battle group from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean in a day, rather than 3 weeks around, which requires having much more equipment and much more men and personnel in the area. We transit the area. We cooperate in security conferences. We discuss terrorism together. This is a whole relationship. We're not going to sacrifice 35 years of relation building with a country in 2 weeks or a week. We're going to try to maintain that relationship. The difficulty is the people of Egypt are on a very different wavelength than we are. American approval rating in Egypt is 1% in the last poll. It's hard to get that low. If we cut off the aid, many Egyptians, not the military, but many of the Egyptians would say, good, we don't want that relationship. We have to proceed cautiously. Our inclination as Americans is they're doing bad things there, we should cut it off immediately. But as a government, they have to make a decision based on history, national interest, and calculations over a period of time. They will be cautious in this.
And President Obama has tried to say, well, listen, we're not taking any sides, and I don't know how convincing he is, but let's listen very quickly to what President Obama said to the Egyptian people about this.
America cannot determine the future of Egypt. That's a task for the Egyptian people. We don't take sides with any particular party or political figure. We want Egypt to succeed.
Is that selling in Egypt, Mr. Sofer, right now? We're not taking sides. It's not our problem. Both sides are blaming us.
I don't think it's selling very well in Egypt, and regardless of what the kind of reality is, where I do think that U.S. interests are largely focused on, trying to kind of lower the, situation, trying to de-escalate the temperature. I think both sides are blaming us, both sides. There are a lot of conspiracy theories running around. There's a lot of misinformation running around. You talk to the Brotherhood and they believe that the U.S. has always been out to get the Brotherhood. We've been supportive of the coup. You talk to a lot of the folks that are supportive of the military and they believe that the U.S. has been supportive of the Brotherhood, that we want President Morsi, Morsi to be reinstated. And I don't think either of those have been true. And so we're kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You have a lot of folks from both sides that view kind of any action within this larger conspiracy narrative that says, the U.S. is, out to get us. And this is part of, what Dr. Bannerman was saying. Our kind of state-to-state, military-to-military relationships are fantastic in Egypt. But our relationships with almost every other sector in the kind of Egyptian society are terrible. We haven't really kind of deepened and broadened our relationships, and that's been part of the problem. Since 2011, we had the kind of top leadership replaced, and a lot of our relationships vanished overnight. We didn't have very good relationships with the Muslim Brotherhood leadership that came in. We have some relationships now, especially with the military folks that are kind of running the country, but the sort of engagement that we've had at the societal level across the kind of broad, swath of society has not been very good, and I think that that's why people are, viewing all U.S. actions within this larger conspiracy narrative.
Now, we know that Israel's been lobbying very hard for U.S. not to cut off that aid. What are they worried about in that region if the aid is cut off?
Well, they view the aid as part of the Camp David peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. They view that as an essential element, and if you begin to take away the essential elements, they're afraid of where that's going to go. I think their fears are misplaced. I think the Egyptians view the Treaty of Peace between Egypt and Israel as being in Egyptians' national interest, and that's why they live by it. Now, would it possibly in the future lead to cooler relations and potential problems? Yes. I mean, for example, there's nothing in the peace treaty that says Egypt can't recognize the Hamas government in Gaza. There's nothing that says they can't arm people in Gaza. But they haven't done that because that'd be harmful to the treaty. If things get strained in the future, would they do those things? I don't think so, but it's always hanging out there. But would they basically declare war on Israel or end the peace treaty along their border? It's not in Egypt's interest. They're not going to do that. Egyptians act in Egypt's interest, and Israelis act in Israelis' interest, and Americans should be acting in Americans' interest.
And what is America's interest right now, Mr. Sofer? It seems very hard to determine. Maybe you have a better insight.
Well, I think one of the kind of key things that we're focusing on is improving the process, trying to create kind of an open, democratic, inclusive government that includes all the different actors of Egyptian society. I think more generally this is part of broader issue going on with the whole region. The whole region seems to be in turmoil, and you have these schisms and divisions across the region that are playing out. A lot of the kind of actors in the region that we've wanted to take a larger role in the region, the Gulf countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, as well as countries like Turkey, have really stepped in on different sides of this. You have Qatar and Turkey and Libya who provided $10 billion in aid before the coup, and then you've had, I believe, $15 billion in aid between Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait since the coup. You see similar sort of fractions in Syria going on. These regional actors are really stepping in and acting in their own interest in a way that has sometimes been counter to U.S. interests, which has mostly been to kind of keep the sort of stability going on in the region, prevent the sort of what are largely kind of domestic internal political crises from spilling over to the region and kind of creating some sort of larger regional crisis.
And that's the interesting thing. Why is Saudi Arabia, for example, anti-Morsi in this case and pro-military, and why is Turkey on the other side, or some of the other regional players, Dr.
Well, clearly from the beginning, the government in Turkey and the government in Doha have supported the Muslim Brotherhood government. It's partly of this broader regional identity into this transnational Islamic movement. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait don't believe in that. They believe that is very harmful to their own interest. Now, while they they agree in certain areas, like in Syria, they don't support the Assad regime. They don't believe in this transnational movement. Therefore, it was absolutely to be expected that Doha and Ankara would be appalled at the events in Egypt, while the others would immediately come in. Clearly, this had been somewhat engineered beforehand. I mean, clearly the government in Egypt, the military, had been in contact with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. You would not have gotten the quick response that they did to support them if there hadn't been some pre-action conversations.
Or kind of pre-approval from at least those governments.
You have to understand, in the end, the Egyptians are going to act in the Egyptian interest. All of us on the outside are outsiders. And I think there's no question that the Muslim Brotherhood has won the battle for international opinion at this point. But internally, what's remarkable is they have lost the battle for opinion. And so you have this dichotomy where you have the Muslim Brotherhood winning in the international arena, but losing at home.
Now, here's the question, Mr. Sofer. At this point, looking at some of the pictures that we've looked at and the kind of violence we've seen, is there any chance of having those elections that the military promised?
Oh, certainly not anytime soon. I mean, you're going to have an incredible de-escalation of violence. I think that you've some of the societal divisions that had been forming and existed in Egypt, kind of up through 2011 in the past 2 years have really hardened, have really deepened. It's going to be a lot harder to kind of bridge those divides. And one of the things that's the most troubling, as we watch this, it's the sort of rhetoric that's being used. It's not just, the military is not just fighting a political actor in the Muslim Brotherhood. They're fighting what they call terrorists. When the Muslim Brotherhood responds, they're not talking about a political situation that needs to be resolved by elections. They're talking about dying for the cause. They're talking about being martyrs. So the escalation of rhetoric, that kind of deepening of these divisions, and the idea that that letting the other side kind of back in, letting them win. I think that those are the sort of things that will prevent any sort of elections coming in any time in the near future.
And he's raised a good point, Dr. Bannerman. I was very curious as to why the military, right from the beginning, even before Wednesday's crackdown, was calling them terrorists.
I think they saw actions that occurred, the violence, as acts of terrorism. I think the rhetoric is overstated. Don't mistake what I'm saying here. But I think when policemen are shot and where there's demonstrations, Molotov cocktails, and there are clashes, they view them as that. I think you talk to the people on the street who aren't Muslim brothers, and that they viewed the demonstrators. They were even much harsher than any rhetoric coming out of the government. It is. I agree with you totally. It is very worrisome, and particularly for the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is facing a dilemma. The longer they continue this, the more they reinforce the idea that they don't care about Egypt because it's destroying the country. They care only about themselves and their international cause. At the same time, they've been terribly treated. They feel terribly offended. How would you feel? They feel they participated in the process and they were doing it right, and they went. Of course, were insensitive to what democracy really means, but that doesn't change their own feeling of indignation. Somehow, they're going to have to get beyond this, and at this point, there's nobody on the inside who can do it, and there's nobody on the outside.
Do you think that there can be a different level of violence if the pro-military people, for example, and by pro-military I mean people who are pro-coup, come out on the streets? Is there any chance of that?
I think we've kind of already started to see it. The sort of vigilantism, the kind of extrajudicial justice that's been happening on both sides. Certainly, there's been a lot of violence by the military against the pro-military supporters. But we've seen the burning of churches by a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood supporters. We've seen kind of random acts of violence and to an extent terror by some of the Muslim Brotherhood supporters. And we've seen on the other side, the kind of pro-military civilians arming themselves and attacking kind of random individuals. We've seen this sort of extrajudicial justice happening over the last 2 years, and that's one of the other issues. And to an extent, I don't know if the military really has the ability to kind of fully come in and stomp out all of that violence, and I'm afraid to see what that would look like if they try to do it.
And Dr. Bannerman, very quickly at the end, what's your biggest fear if this gets worse?
The list is so long of greatest fears. It's going to spin out of control, and none of us will have any control of what happens. It's very sad. It's terrible for Egypt, and that's a disaster for everybody in the region.
How will the region be affected if this gets out of hand?
Well, like I mentioned before, Egypt for a long time has been, a kind of cultural beacon, a ideological beacon, a political beacon for the entire region, and in a lot of ways, the region looks to Egypt as kind of a maiden signaler. So, if Egypt, goes to hell in a handbasket, I'm afraid to see where the rest of the region goes.
And are we already seeing some of the spill-off with the relationship of the Muslim Brotherhood in other parts of the region, or we have to yet see that?
Well, I think this is a setback for the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the region, in the sense. It is the most important headquarters, and they lost power. That has to be a setback for the Muslim Brotherhood. I want to make a point is, just because the Muslim Brotherhood has a setback doesn't mean that the trend in the region towards more Islamic identity will not continue. They will. In Egypt, they say, we're not fighting over the Muslim Brotherhood, we're fighting over the type of Islam we want, not whether we're Muslims or not. It is within the Islamic community.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you and we definitely will be watching the situation very carefully, but our time today is up. I want to thank our guests. Before we leave, Ken Sofa with the Center for American Progress focuses on U.S. policy in the Middle East, and Dr. Graham Bannerman is a Middle East analyst who's worked both with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the State Department. And thank you for watching us. Don't forget to check out the website urduvoa.com for the latest. Leave your comments on our Facebook page. Until next time, goodbye.